Who got you that dress? The words didn't just break the silence of the penthouse. They shattered it like glass. Renee Althea Reed froze mid-step, her heart hammering against her ribs. In 300 days of service, she had never heard Park Do-Joon raise his voice, and she had certainly never seen him lose his icy, legendary composure. But tonight, the king of the Seoul underworld wasn't looking at her like an assistant. He was looking at her like a man whose most prized possession had been touched by a stranger, and her next breath would decide if someone was going to die before dawn. The elevator doors had opened moments ago with a soft, expensive chime, revealing a domain of marble and gold that felt more like a cage than a home. Renee had stepped out, the clicking of her heels sounding like a countdown. This morning, the red silk had felt like a bold choice, elegant daring, a splash of color in a life of gray. But standing now in the shadow of Do-Joon's private world, the fabric felt like a target painted on her skin. She smoothed her trembling hands over the satin, painfully aware of how far this was from her armor. For nearly a year, she had survived by being the ghost in the room. High necklines, charcoal blazers, and invisible efficiency had been her shield. She was the perfect employee for the man who ruled an empire from the shadows. She had grown comfortable, dangerously so, forgetting that the man who signed her paychecks was the same man people whisper about in terrified tones. I asked you a question, Renee. His voice drifted from the darkened floor-to-ceiling windows, low and vibrating with a frequency she didn't recognize. Danger. She turned, her breath catching. Do-Joon stood backlit by the sprawling city lights, his silhouette sharp, predatory, and impeccably tailored. Even from across the room, she could see the rigid line of his shoulders and the way his knuckles had turned white where his hands were curled into fists. He stepped into the light, and Renee's stomach dropped. His eyes weren't their usual cold brown. They were black with possessive fury that made her every instinct scream for her to run. His gaze traveled down her body with agonizing slowness, tracing the curve of the red silk, the dip of the neckline, and the way the fabric clung to her hips like a lover's touch. When he finally locked eyes with hers, the muscle in his jaw was ticking like a time bomb. Who got you that dress? It wasn't a request for information. It was an accusation. It was the sound of a king realizing that for the first time in his life, there was someone he didn't fully own, and he was willing to burn the city down to get the answer. The silence in the penthouse was a physical weight, pressing the air from Renee's lungs as she remained pinned against the cold marble wall. Do-Joon's shadow loomed over her, his scent, a mix of expensive sandalwood and the metallic tang of unsheathed power, filling her senses. As his jaw remained clenched, waiting for an answer she was too terrified to voice, Renee's mind involuntarily drifted back to the 300 days of shadows that had led them to this fracture. For 10 months, Renee had lived by a singular, ironclad rule: be the ghost in the machine. She had been the perfect, invisible architect of Park Do-Joon's daily life. She knew his schedule down to the microsecond, knew how he liked his mountain-grown tea at exactly 82 degrees, and knew which international associates required a bow and which required a cold stare. She had worn her charcoal blazers and high-collar white shirts like a suit of armor, a deliberate uniform designed to neutralize her womanhood and highlight her utility. She remembered the first day she walked into the syndicate's glass and steel headquarters. The air had been thick with the unspoken threat of violence that followed Do-Joon like a loyal hound. She had seen the way other women looked at him, with a mix of hunger and primal fear, and she had vowed never to be one of them. She had stayed late, her desk the only light in the sprawling office, organizing files that contained secrets capable of toppling governments. She had kept her head down, her responses restricted to "Yes, Mr. Park," and "It's been handled, sir." Through those 300 days, Do-Joon had been a statue of ice. He had looked through her rather than at her, his commands clipped and professional. She thought she had succeeded in becoming a part of the furniture, a reliable tool in his vast, lethal toolkit. She had prided herself on that invisibility. It was safe. It was professional. It allowed her to exist in the periphery of a monster without being consumed by his fire. But there had been cracks, moments she had dismissed as her own imagination. The way his hand would linger a second too long when she handed him a file. The way the room's temperature seemed to rise whenever he walked past her desk. The way his intense, dark eyes would sometimes track her movement across the room when he thought she wasn't looking. She had told herself she was being vain, that a king of the underworld had no interest in a girl who hid herself in oversized blazers and pulled back hair. Then, 3 days ago, the box had arrived. No card, no name, just a red silk dress, glowing like a bed of embers against the tissue paper. For the first time in 300 days, Renee had wanted to be seen. She had wanted to shed the charcoal skin of the assistant and feel the dangerous heat of being a woman. Now, staring into black abyss of Do-Joon's eyes, she realized the devastating magnitude of her mistake. Her invisibility hadn't been a shield. It had been a stay of execution. By putting on the dress, she hadn't just changed her clothes. She had signaled that she was no longer content in the shadows. And for a man like Park Do-Joon, who ruled through absolute possession, her emergence into the light was a provocation he couldn't ignore. The 300 days of shadows were over, and the fire had finally arrived. Do-Joon watched the pulse jumping in Renee's throat, his own breath shallow and jagged. To the outside world, he was a man of ice, a sovereign who ruled the Seoul underworld with a calculation that bordered on the divine. But inside the sanctuary of his penthouse, the mask was disintegrating. He had spent 300 days meticulously constructing a lie, convincing himself that Renee Althea Reed was merely a highly efficient cog in his machine. He had forced himself to look past her, to treat her like the marble floors beneath his feet, expensive, reliable, and inanimate. But the lie had died the moment she stepped out of that elevator. He had been obsessed since the first hour of the first day. He remembered the way she had walked into her interview, her spine straight and her eyes wary, carrying an air of quiet dignity that felt like a challenge to his darkness. From that moment, he had quietly rearranged his world to keep her within his orbit. He had created tasks that required her presence late into the evening, just so he could hear the rhythmic tapping of her keyboard. He had memorized the scent of her vanilla-tinged perfume, a scent that now mocked him as it mingled with the heavy air of the penthouse. He had convinced himself that as long as she stayed in her charcoal blazers and kept her hair bound tight, he could keep the monster in his chest caged. He could pretend his interest was purely professional. The red dress changed everything. It was a breach of his borders. As he stared down at her, the crimson fabric seemed to bleed into his vision. It wasn't just that she looked breathtaking. It was the fact that the dress was a message. Someone else had seen the woman he tried so hard to hide. Someone else had dared to imagine the curves of her body and had the audacity to wrap them in silk. Every time his eyes traced a plunging neckline or the way the hem brushed her thighs, a primitive, white-hot rage surged through him. It was a territorial instinct he hadn't felt in years, the urge to destroy anything that dared to lay a finger on what he considered his. He felt the heat radiating from her skin, and for a fleeting, dangerous second, he wanted to crush her against him just to see if she would break or bend. He hated how much power she held in this moment. He was a king of Gangnam, a man who moved lives like chess pieces, yet he was currently unraveling because a yard of red satin and the terrifying thought that Renee might belong to someone else. His hand, braced against the wall beside her head, trembled with the effort of not reaching out to touch her jaw. He had spent 10 months playing a game of restraint, building a fortress of professional distance. But as he looked at her wide, pleading eyes, Do-Joon realized the fortress had been made of sand. The dress had washed it all away, leaving nothing but the raw, jagged truth of his hunger. He didn't want an assistant. He didn't want a ghost. He wanted her, and he wanted the head of the man who thought he could buy her a gift. The control he had prized above all else was gone, replaced by a singular, lethal focus. She was in his territory now, and he would make sure she understood that no one else would ever be allowed to see her like this again. The tension in the penthouse was still vibrating between them like a live wire when the elevator chimed again, signaling an intrusion Renee hadn't expected. Do-Joon didn't pull away immediately. He lingered in her space for a heartbeat longer than necessary, his dark eyes searing a final promise into hers before he straightened his posture. He didn't fix his tie or smooth his hair. He simply reverted to the terrifying, stoic King Renee had known for 300 days, though the air around him remained charged with a violent, electric heat. The man who stepped out of the elevator was Kang Dae, a business partner, whose smile never quite reached his eyes, and whose reputation for cruelty was the only thing that rivaled Do-Joon's. He was here for the high-stakes meeting Do-Joon had mentioned, the reason Renee had dressed up in the first place. But as Kang-dae's eyes swept the room, they didn't land on a file spread across the mahogany desk. They landed on Renee. Renee felt the predatory shift in the room instantly. Kang-dae's gaze crawled over the red silk of her dress with a slow, oily appreciation that made her skin itch. She tried to reclaim her professional mask, stepping toward the desk to arrange the documents, but Kang-dae intercepted her path. Do-Joon, Kang-dae drawled, his voice thick with a fake camaraderie. I knew you had an eye for talent, but I didn't realize you were hiding something this delicious in your shadows. He reached out, his hand hovering near Renee's waist, his fingers twitching as if to test the quality of the silk. That dress is a masterpiece. It fits you like a second skin, darling. I wonder if the man who bought it for you knows just how much it invites a man to take it off. The temperature in the room didn't just drop. It froze. Renee saw Do-Joon's silhouette sharpen. He didn't shout. He didn't even move fast. He simply appeared. One moment he was by the window, and the next he was standing between Renee and Kang-dae, his presence a wall of pure, lethal intent. She is my assistant, Kang-dae, Do-Joon said, his voice a low, guttural warning. And you are here to discuss territory, not her attire. Kang-dae laughed, a sharp, grating sound. Don't be greedy. Do-Joon, a woman in a dress like that isn't meant for filing papers. She's meant for... Before Kang-dae could finish the sentence, Do-Joon moved. It was a blur of black cloth and controlled violence. He didn't go for his weapon. Instead, he caught Kang-dae's reaching hand in a grip that sounded like dry wood snapping. A sickening crack echoed to the penthouse, followed by a choked gasp of agony from a rival leader. Do-Joon didn't let go. He leaned in, his face inches from Kang-dae's, his jaw set in that same ticking time bomb rhythm Renee had seen earlier. You mentioned territory, Do-Joon whispered, his voice sounding like a blade being drawn over stone. Let this be your first lesson. This room, these floors, and every breath she takes in my presence, that is my territory. If your hand wanders near what is mine again, I won't just break the bones. I'll take the arm. He shoved Kang-dae back toward the elevator, the rival cradling his shattered hand, his face pale with shock and pain. As the doors hissed shut on the intruder, Do-Joon turned back to Renee. He didn't look triumphant. He looked hunted. The breach had been closed, but the war for control, both over his empire and the woman in the red dress, had only just begun. The violent echo of Kang-dae's shattered hand still seemed to resonate in the penthouse long after the elevator had swallowed his screams. Renee stood paralyzed, her gaze fixed on Do-Joon's back. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood with his shoulders heaving slightly, a king surveying a battlefield that had become far too personal. The red silk of her dress felt like a brand, a mark of ownership that had nearly cost a man his life and had definitely stripped away the last of Renee's anonymity. By the next morning, the weight of the garment was unbearable. It sat in its expensive box on her vanity, glowing like a pool of fresh blood. She needed it gone. She needed to return to the shadows of her charcoal blazers and the safety of her high-collared shirts. If she could just return the dress, she reasoned, she could return the world to the way it was before Do-Joon had pinned her against the wall. She took the morning off, a first in 300 days, and drove to the exclusive boutique in Cheongdam-dong, whose label was stitched into the lining. The shop was a temple of minimalist luxury, smelling of white lilies and quiet money. When she placed the box on the counter, the clerk's eyes widened, recognizing the piece instantly. I'd like to return this, Renee said, her voice steadier than she felt. It was sent to me by mistake. The clerk tapped into a sleek tablet, her brow furrowing as she scrolled through the digital ledgers. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Ms. Reed. This was a custom acquisition. The transaction is already finalized. Then I'll take a store credit. Renee pushed, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Just tell me who the purchaser was. I need to send the reimbursement. The clerk looked up, her expression flickering with a mix of pity and professional detachment. That's the difficulty. The buyer came in person 3 days ago. He paid the full amount, $40,000, in cash, raw currency. She paused, leaning in slightly. He refused to provide a name, a phone number, or an address. In our system, the buyer is listed as a ghost. He only specified that it was to be delivered to your doorstep at exactly 6 p.m. Renee felt the air leave her lungs. In a city like Seoul, where every digital footprint was tracked and every transaction left a trail, $40,000 in cash was more than just a gift. It was a signature. It was a calling card of someone who operated in the same sunless world as Do-Joon, someone who knew exactly how to trigger the king's most violent instincts. She walked out of the boutique, the box tucked under her arm like a lead weight. The dress wasn't a gift. It was a trap. It had been meticulously chosen to strip her of her professional armor and provoke the man she worked for. As she climbed into her car, she caught a reflection in the rear-view mirror. For 10 months, she had thought she was the one watching Do-Joon from the shadows. She realized now with a jolt of pure terror that someone else had been watching her, measuring her worth not in efficiency, but in how much damage she could cause to the king of Gangnam. The dress was a declaration of war, and she was the battlefield. The following Monday, the sanctuary of the shadows was officially revoked. When Renee arrived at the syndicate headquarters, she found her sleek, minimalist workstation in the outer office stripped bare. Her monitors, her files, and even her favorite fountain pen had been moved. "From now on, you work in here," Do-Joon said, his voice dropping like a heavy curtain as he opened the double oak doors to his private inner sanctum. The shift was immediate and suffocating. His private office was a cathedral of dark wood, leather, and the hushed hum of high-stakes power. But with Renee's desk now positioned directly across from his own, the space felt smaller than a glass jar. For 10 months, she had functioned behind a wall of frosted glass. Now, there was nothing between them but 15 feet of air that felt thick with unspoken accusations and the lingering heat of the previous Friday. Working under Do-Joon's direct gaze was a physical weight. He didn't speak to her for the first 4 hours, yet his presence was a constant, low-frequency vibration that made the fine hairs on her neck stand up. Every time she reached for the telephone or shifted in her chair, she could feel his eyes tracking the movement, lingering on the curve of her shoulder or the line of her throat. He was no longer a boss reviewing an employee. He was a sovereign watching over his borders, ensuring that no further ghosts could slip through the cracks of her life. The silence in the room was predatory. It was the sound of a man who had stopped pretending he wasn't obsessed. When he finally did move, rising to pace the floor behind her while he took a call in rapid-fire Korean, Renee felt her breath hitch. The scent of his sandalwood cologne wrapped around her like a physical touch, and the shadow of his tall, broad frame fell over her keyboard, momentarily claiming the space she occupied. She was hyper-aware of the loosened knot of his tie and the way his shirt sleeves were rolled up to reveal the cords of muscle in his forearms, the same arms that had broken a man's hand from merely looking at her. "The Choi report," he murmured, leaning over her shoulder to point at a line on her screen. He didn't touch her, but he was so close she could feel the radiating warmth of his body. His voice was a low vibration against her ear, sending a traitorous shiver down her spine. "Correct the projections for the Busan docks. I want no room for error." "Yes, Mr. Park," she whispered, her fingers fumbling over the keys. "Look at me, Renee." She turned slowly, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was looking at her with a raw, unshielded intensity that made her feel more exposed than the red dress ever had. There was no ice left in his eyes, only a dark, burning possessiveness that demanded she acknowledge the shift in their world. The office had become a cage, but as Renee looked into the depths of his gaze, she realized with a start that she wasn't sure which one of them was the prisoner and which one was a guard. The 300 days of distance were dead, replaced by a proximity so absolute it felt like she was being slowly consumed by the king's shadow. The invitation to the annual syndicate gala was not a request. It was a deployment. For Renee, it meant stepping back into the very silk that had started the fire. Do-Joon had been explicit. The underworld was watching for a crack in his armor after the incident with Kang Dae, and they needed to present a front of absolute, icy stability. Renee was to attend not as his guest, but as his shadow, the silent, efficient assistant who stayed 3 steps behind his left shoulder. The grand ballroom of the Latte Hotel was a sea of black tuxedos and sharp diamonds, a gathering of the city's most dangerous predators disguised as its most elite citizens. Renee felt every eye in the room track her as she moved through the crowd. The red dress, what had felt like a secret in the privacy of the penthouse, now felt like a scream in the middle of a library. The satin clung to her as she trailed Do-Joon, her tablet in hand, playing the role of the diligent employee while her skin burned under the weight of his proximity. Do-Joon was a master of the mask. He moved through the gala with a terrifying, detached elegance, nodding to billionaires and whispering orders to captains of industry without ever letting his gaze settle on Renee for more than a professional second. To the casual observer, he was a cold, untouchable king of Gangnam. He treated her with a clinical indifference that made her heart ache with a strange, hollow longing. He ignored the way the low back of her dress exposed the smooth line of her spine, and he didn't flinch when a rival leader pointedly complimented his exquisite taste in staff. But Renee knew him better now. She saw the way his jaw remained a rigid, permanent line of tension. She noticed how his hand gripped his crystal glass, so tightly his knuckles turned white whenever a man lingered too long in her personal space. The cold boss was a performance, a thin veil of glass stretched over a volcano. Every time she stepped forward to whisper a scheduled update into his ear, the air between them reached a flashpoint. She could smell the familiar sandalwood and the sharp, metallic tang of his restrained adrenaline. "Keep your head up, Renee," he murmured, his voice barely a breath against the ambient noise of the string quartet. He didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on a group of associates across the room. "And stay within my sight. The sharks are circling, and they think the red you're wearing is blood in the water." The Gala of Knives was aptly named. Beneath the polite toasts and the clinking of fine china, the tension was lethal. Renee realized that Do-Joon's coldness wasn't an insult. It was his only way of protecting her. If he showed even a flicker of the possessiveness that had consumed him in the office, he would be handing his enemies the one weapon they had been searching for, his heart. As she stood in the center of the glittering room, Renee finally understood the true cost of her new position. She was a king's secret weakness, wrapped in red satin, walking through a room full of men who lived for the kill. The gala was no longer a party. It was a gauntlet, and the night was only just beginning. The string quartet transitioned into a slow, haunting waltz that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the ballroom. Renee stood at the edge of the dance floor, her fingers tightening around her tablet as she watched Do-Joon navigate a circle of ruthless investors. He was the picture of surgical detachment, his face a mass of granite. But the gala was a theater of predators, and the silence between them had finally invited a strike. It came in the form of Minho, a rising lieutenant from a rival faction, known more for his recklessness than his business acumen. He didn't approach Do-Joon. He approached the woman in red. "A dress like that is a sin to keep standing still," Minho said, his voice loud enough to carry over the music. He stepped into Renee's personal space, the scent of expensive bourbon clinging to him like a shroud. "They say Park Do-Joon treats his staff like shadows, but I've always preferred my shadows with a little more movement." Renee felt the eyes of the entire room shift toward them. She looked toward Do-Joon, hoping for a silent signal to retreat. But he was deep in conversation, his back turned. She tried to step back, her voice low and professional. "I'm working, Mr. Minho. If you have business with the syndicate—" "I have business with you," Minho interrupted, his hand snaking out to grip her waist. The touch was a violation, a deliberate slap in the face to the king of Gangnam. He began to pull her toward the dance floor, his grin mocking and sharp. "Just one dance, Althea. Let's see if you're as soft as the silk you're wearing." The ballroom went deathly quiet. The music continued, but the atmosphere shattered. Renee didn't see Do-Joon move. One moment he was 30 feet away, and the next, the air seemed to distort with the sheer force of his arrival. He didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. He stepped into the light, his hand clamping onto Minho's wrist with a grip that caused the rival's face to drain of all color. "Release her," Do-Joon said. The words weren't loud, but they carried a vibration of a tectonic shift. It was the sound of a man who had finally reached the end of his restraint. "It's just a dance, Do-Joon," Minho stammered, his bravado crumbling under black, bottomless fury in Do-Joon's eyes. No need to get possessive over an assistant. "She is not an assistant," Do-Joon growled, his voice dropping to a guttural register that made the fine hairs on Renee's neck stand up. She is mine, and you are breathing my air. With a brutal shove that sent Minho stumbling back into a table of crystal glassware, Do-Joon turned to Renee. He didn't care about the gasps from the socialites or the narrowed eyes of his enemies. The cold boss was gone. In his place stood a man who had completely lost control to the monster of jealousy. He didn't ask. He reached out and seized Renee's hand, his fingers lacing through hers with possessive strength that bordered on painful. He pulled her flush against his chest, his heart thundering against her own to the layers of black wool and red silk. Without a word to the stunned crowd, he began to lead her away, his stride long and relentless as he dragged her toward the exit. The mass had been burned to ashes, and as they swept past the rows of shocked faces, Renee realized there was no going back. The king had claimed his queen in the most violent way possible, by showing the world exactly how much he was willing to lose for her. The silence of the penthouse was no longer the heavy, professional quiet Renee had respected for 10 months. It was a pressurized chamber, humming with the aftermath of the gala's violence. The elevator doors hissed shut, locking them away from the world of prying eyes and rival threats. Do-Joon didn't let go of her hand until they reached the center of the vast, marble-floored living area. When he finally released her, he didn't move away. He began to pace, his strides agitated, his fingers tugging at his tie until the silk hung loose and ruined against his chest. Renee stood by the edge of the sunken lounge, her breath coming in shallow hitches. The red dress felt like a weight of lead now, its brilliance mocking the chaos it had wrought. She watched him, the man who ruled an empire, with a whisper, looking like he was ready to tear the walls down with his bare hands. "You should have left me there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do-Joon, everyone saw. You've handed them your throat. They know you care." He stopped mid-stride, his back to her. His shoulders were rigid, the muscles of his neck straining against his collar. For a long moment he didn't speak, and the only sound was the distant hum of the city lights glowing through the glass. When he finally turned, the king was gone. The mask hadn't just slipped, it had been incinerated. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with a desperation that made Renee's heart stop. "You think I care about them?" he rasped, his voice breaking in a way she had never heard. He closed the distance between them in 3 predatory steps, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "You think I care about a throne or a title when I spent the entire night watching men look at you like you were something they could buy, something they could touch?" He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his fingers finally brushed her cheek, his touch surprisingly soft despite the fury in his eyes. "For 300 days, I practiced the art of forgetting you were a woman. I forced myself to look at files, at docs, at ledgers, because if I looked at you for more than a second, I knew I wouldn't be able to stop." He let out a jagged, hollow laugh, his hand sliding into her hair, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a possessive intensity. "I told myself I was protecting you by keeping you in the shadows. But then you put on this dress. You stepped into the light, and I realized I've been suffocating for a year. Renee, I can't breathe when you're in the room. I can't think. I can't lead." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his breath hot against her lips. "I'm not losing control because of a rival or a gift. I'm losing it because I realize I would rather see the city burn to ground than see you in another man's arms for even a second. It's not a weakness, Renee. It's a haunting." The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. Renee looked up at him, seeing the monster and the man intertwined, realizing that her invisibility had been his only sanity. Now that the light had found them, there was no more safety, only the beautiful, terrifying fire of a man who had finally admitted he belonged to her. The fragile intimacy of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by the cold, rhythmic vibration of Do-Joon's secure phone against a marble countertop. He didn't pull away from Renee immediately. He took a final, ragged breath against her temple, his grip tightening for a fleeting second, as if anchoring himself to the only real thing in his world. When he finally answered, his voice had returned to that terrifying, low-frequency hum that signaled the king had returned to his throne. "Speak," he commanded. Renee watched from the shadows of the lounge, her skin still humming from his touch, as Do-Joon's face went from a mask of raw emotion to a sculpture of lethal intent. He didn't say a word as he listened, but the muscle in his jaw began that rhythmic, time bomb ticking. After a moment, he hit the speakerphone, and a voice like dry gravel filled the room. A voice Renee recognized as Choi, the aging head of the Northern Districts and Do-Joon's most calculating rival. "You've become predictable, Do-Joon." Choi's voice crackled, laced with disturbing amusement. "I remember a time when you were made of stone and shadow. A man who couldn't be baited, couldn't be moved. But tonight at the gala, I watched the king unravel over a few yards of red silk and a girl from the shadows." Renee felt the blood drain from her face. The boutique, the cash payment, the ghost. It had all been a surgical strike by a man who understood that Do-Joon's greatest defense was his indifference. "The dress was a gift for me," Choi continued, his laugh a raspy, wheezing sound. "A modest investment to see if the rumors were true. They say a man's pulse is his greatest treachery. I sent that red satin to test yours, Do-Joon. I wanted to see if the great Park Do-Joon still had a heart, or if he had finally become the monster we all feared. And tonight, when you broke Minho's dignity and dragged that girl out of the room, you gave me my answer. You didn't just have a pulse, you had a fever." Do-Joon's eyes locked onto Renee's, his gaze dark and unreadable. He didn't look angry at her. He looked at her with a terrifying clarity, as if he were seeing the target Choi had painted on her back. "You made a mistake, Choi," Do-Joon said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a death warrant. "You want to find my pulse. You wanted to find my weakness. But you forgot one thing about a man who finally finds something worth holding on to. And what is that?" Choi sneered. "He stops playing by the rules of the civilized," Do-Joon replied, his fingers hovering over the end call button. "You didn't find my weakness, Choi. You found the reason I'm going to erase you from this city. You used her to get to me. Now, you'll find out what happens when the monster you were so afraid of finally has something to protect." He cut the line, the silence that followed more deafening than the conversation. Renee realized then that the dress hadn't just been a trap for Do-Joon. It was a death sentence for anyone who tried to come between them. Choi had found the king's pulse, but in doing so, he had awakened a predator that no longer cared about the shadows. The war was no longer about territory. It was about the woman in the red dress. The following evening, the city of Seoul felt different, colder, sharper, as if the skyscrapers themselves were leaning in to watch the fallout of Do-Joon's declaration. Renee had insisted on taking her own car home, a desperate attempt to reclaim a sliver of the invisible life she had led for 300 days. She needed to breathe air that didn't smell of Do-Joon's sandalwood or the metallic tang of his brewing war. But the shadows she had once called home were no longer empty. As she turned into the narrow, rain-slick street leading to her apartment complex, a black SUV roared from a side alley, swerving to block her path with a screech of burning rubber. Before she could throw her car into reverse, a second vehicle slammed into her rear bumper, pinning her in a jagged cage of steel. Renee's heart surged into her throat, the rhythm of frantic, terrified echo of the night before. She reached for her phone, but the driver's side window shattered inward in a spray of glittering diamonds. A man with a jagged scar across his brow and the cold eyes of a professional reached through the broken glass, his fingers clawing for her throat. "Choi wants to see if the king's pulse stops when his heart is cut out," the man hissed, his voice barely audible over the rain. Renee fought, her nails raking across his skin. But the strength of a woman who had spent a year behind a desk was no match for a soldier of the underworld. He dragged her through the window, her knees hitting the wet asphalt, the world spinning into a blur of gray light and terror. She thought of Do-Joon, of the way he had admitted he couldn't breathe without her, and a hollow, sickening guilt consumed her. She was the weapon Choi was using to kill him. Throw her in, a voice barked, but the command was cut short by a sound like a thunderclap. The street erupted. From the rooftops and the seemingly empty storefronts, figures in tactical black materialized like wraiths born from the darkness itself. There was no shouting, no warning, only the rhythmic, suppressed whip of high-caliber rounds and a heavy thud of bodies hitting the pavement. Renee was suddenly shielded by a wall of Kevlar and shadow. A man with a visible neck tattoo and a face like carved stone stepped over her, his weapon raised with surgical precision. This was Do-Joon's death squad, the elite, silent protectors who existed only in the terrifying whispers of the syndicate. They didn't move like men. They moved like an extension of Do-Joon's own will. Within seconds, the silence returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. The men who had tried to take her were gone, either dead or dragged into the darkness for a far worse fate. The lead operative turned to Renee, his eyes devoid of emotion, but his posture one of absolute deference. "Mr. Park is waiting, Ms. Reed," the operative said, his voice as cold as the rain. "He gave us orders to ensure that not a single drop of your blood touched the ground. He said if we failed, there would be no ground left in Seoul for us to stand on." Renee looked at the wreckage of her car and the stillness of the street. She realized then that she was no longer just an assistant or even a woman in a red dress. She was the center of gravity for a monster. And as she was ushered into the back of a waiting armored car, she knew that Do-Joon wouldn't just erase Choi. He would burn the very idea of him from existence. The following morning, the sun did not so much rise over Seoul as it struggled to pierce a thick, suffocating fog. Inside the war room of the syndicate, Park Do-Joon stood before a bank of monitors, his tailored black jacket discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink and sinew of a man born for conflict. The failed kidnapping of Renee had stripped away the last of his humanity. He no longer looked like a businessman. He looked like an ancient, vengeful god. Choi didn't just target an employee. Do-Joon said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that made his most seasoned captains avert their eyes. "He touched the only thing in this world that makes my blood run warm. He wanted to see the monster? I will show him the one I've been trying to kill for 300 days. The retaliation was not a battle. It was an erasure. With a single, sharp nod, Do-Joon unleashed the full, unchecked lethality of his empire. Across the city, Choi's influence began to vanish in a series of coordinated strikes that were as silent as they were absolute. Docks were seized, warehouses were leveled, and by midnight, Choi's high-ranking lieutenants had simply ceased to exist. Do-Joon led the final breach himself. He didn't hide in the shadows this time. He walked to the front doors of Choi's private estate, his weapon a cold weight in his hand, his eyes two voids of black fire. When he finally reached the inner-study, he found Choi trembling behind a desk of carved mahogany, the same man who had laughed over his speakerphone about testing the king's pulse. "You wanted to know if I was still a man, Choi," Do-Joon whispered, the sound chillingly calm as he stepped over the threshold. He didn't look at the piles of money or the ledgers. He only saw the face of the man who had dared to put Renee in a cage of broken glass. "You were right. I've been weak. I've been trying to be a leader of men, a man of rules. But for her, I'll be the monster you feared. I'll be the nightmare that ensures no one ever speaks her name in a whisper again." Choi's pleas for mercy were swallowed by the cold air of the room. Do-Joon didn't hesitate. He chose the violence. He chose the darkness. He chose to be the predator that would keep Renee Althea Reed safe, even if it meant he could never truly return to the light himself. By the time he walked out of his state, the northern faction was a memory, and the king's choice was written in the ash of his enemies. He returned to the penthouse as the first light of dawn touched the horizon. He was covered in the dust of his war, his hands steady but his soul heavy with the weight of what he had done. He found Renee waiting by the window, her silhouette a fragile, beautiful thing against the glass. He stopped at the entrance, afraid that the monster he had become would frighten her. But as she turned and ran into his arms, pressing her face against his blood-stained shirt, Do-Joon realized that he hadn't lost himself. He had simply found the only thing worth fighting for. The war for territory was over. The reign of the king and his queen had begun. 6 months after the ashes of Choi's empire had settled into the foundation of a new era, the penthouse was no longer a cage of secrets, but the heart of a shared throne. The red silk dress was gone, tucked away in the back of the cedar closet, a relic of a time when they were both still pretending. In its place, on the velvet lounge where Do-Joon had once confessed his inability to breathe, sat a new box. It was black, embossed with the gold seal of the syndicate, and it hadn't been sent by a ghost. Renee traced the cool fabric of the gown inside. It was deep midnight emerald, the color of a forest at dusk. It was modest yet regal, with a high neckline that paid homage to her days as a ghost, but with a silhouette that left no doubt she was a woman at the king's side. It was a symbol of her new place, a declaration that she no longer needed to hide her beauty to keep her power. Do-Joon appeared in the reflection of the glass, his presence no longer predatory, though the lethal edge of his authority remained. He stepped behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders with a touch that was both a caress and a claim. He wore his usual black suit, but the top button was undone, and the ticking of his jaw had been replaced by a quiet, unwavering calm. "The gala starts in an hour," he murmured, his voice a warm vibration against her hair. "The council is waiting. They want to see if the king has truly gone soft, or if he's simply become more selective with his mercy." Renee turned in his arms, her fingers lacing behind his neck. "And what will they see, Do-Joon?" He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers in the silent intimacy they had fought a war to keep. They will see a man who no longer needs to rule through fear alone. They will see that the shadows have finally merged with the light. When they stepped out of the elevator into the grand ballroom of the Shilla, the atmosphere didn't shatter. It bowed. Renee didn't walk 3 steps behind him. She walked beside him, her hand tucked firmly into the crook of his arm, the emerald silk catching the light with every steady step. There were no anonymous gift tonight, no rivals daring to test a pulse they already knew was steady and lethal. As they reached the center of the room, Do-Joon paused. He didn't look at the billionaires or the captains of industry. He looked only at Renee. In front of the entire underworld, the man who had once broken a hand for a wandering gaze leaned in and kissed her temple. A public coronation that needed no crown. The new queen wasn't just a title given to the woman who had survived the fire. It was the reality of a woman who had taught a monster how to love without losing his teeth. As the music began, a haunting, triumphant waltz, Renee realized that the red dress hadn't been a trap after all. It had been the catalyst. She was no longer the invisible assistant, and he was no longer the lonely king. They were a kingdom unto themselves, and as they moved together across the floor, the city of Seoul lay at their feet, finally silent, finally theirs. Thank you for watching this story unfold. If this story resonated with you, if you felt every moment of tension, every confession, every dangerous choice, then I've done my job. This is what happens when obsession meets devotion, when power meets vulnerability, when 2 people choose each other despite every reason not to. If you want more stories like this, tales of forbidden love, dangerous men, and the women who refuse to run, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me whose POV you connected with more. And if this story kept you watching until the end, share it with someone who loves intense romance. Let's build a community of people who understand that the best love stories aren't safe. They're worth it. Until next time, remember, the right person will burn their whole world down just to keep you warm. Subscribe, like, and comment.